Here's a question that has puzzled historians for centuries. Why did the most powerful Roman who ever lived choose to write his most famous work in Greek? Marcus Aurelius commanded 30 legions, ruled over 60 million people, and was literally called Caesar. Yet when he sat down to write his deepest thoughts about life and philosophy, he didn't use Latin, the language of Roman law, Roman government, and Roman conquest. Instead, this ultimate Roman wrote in Greek. And this wasn't just a casual choice. It reveals something profound about Roman culture that completely contradicts everything most people think they know about the ancient world. The story of why Marcus wrote in Greek is really the story of how Rome conquered Greece militarily, but was conquered by Greece intellectually. And understanding this dynamic might change how you think about cultural influence in our modern globalized world. To understand Marcus's choice, we need to grasp one of history's greatest cultural paradoxes. Rome was the supreme military and political power of the ancient world. Roman legions had conquered from Britain to Mesopotamia. Roman law, Roman engineering, and Roman administration held together the largest empire in human history. Latin was the language of power, spoken from Hadrian's Wall to the Sahara Desert. But when it came to intellectual and cultural prestige, Rome had what we might call a massive inferiority complex, specifically toward Greece. The Romans conquered Greece in 146 BC, but they immediately recognized that Greek culture was simply more sophisticated than their own. Greek had been the language of philosophy for centuries before Rome was even a major power. Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, all the philosophical schools that educated Romans admired had developed in Greek. Greek was also the language of medicine, mathematics, advanced rhetoric, and what we might call high culture. This created a fascinating dynamic. Romans could conquer Greek cities, but they sent their sons to Athens to get educated. Roman generals could defeat Greek armies, but they hired Greek tutors for their children. Roman emperors could rule Greek territories, but they wrote poetry in Greek to prove their sophistication. Marcus Aurelius represents the ultimate expression of this cultural phenomenon. He was literally the most powerful person in the world, yet he felt compelled to express his deepest thoughts in what was, for him, essentially a foreign language. To understand why Marcus wrote in Greek, we need to understand how a Roman aristocrat was educated in the 2nd century AD. Marcus wasn't just any Roman. He was born into the highest levels of Roman society and received what was considered the finest education money could buy. That education was fundamentally bilingual. From childhood, aristocratic Romans learned both Latin and Greek, but they learned them for different purposes. Latin was the language of practical affairs, law, politics, military command, and daily business. Greek was the language of intellectual life, philosophy, advanced literature, scientific discourse, and cultural refinement. Think of it this way. If you were a wealthy Roman parent, you wanted your son to speak Latin well enough to command legions and govern provinces. But you wanted him to speak Greek well enough to discuss philosophy at dinner parties and demonstrate that your family was cultured, not just wealthy. Marcus had some of the finest Greek tutors in the empire. His teacher Junius Rusticus introduced him to the works of Epictetus, the former slave who had become one of Rome's greatest Stoic philosophers. Importantly, Epictetus had taught in Greek, and his ideas were preserved in Greek. When Marcus wanted to engage seriously with Stoic philosophy, he was essentially joining a conversation that had been conducted in Greek for centuries. By the time Marcus became emperor, he was probably more comfortable discussing complex philosophical ideas in Greek than in Latin. Latin had sophisticated philosophical vocabulary, but it was largely borrowed from Greek or translated from Greek concepts. For Marcus, thinking philosophically meant thinking in Greek. Here's where the story gets really interesting. Stoicism, the philosophical school that Marcus followed, was fundamentally a Greek intellectual tradition. It was founded in Athens around 300 BC by Zeno of Citium, and its key concepts were developed in Greek by Greek thinkers. When Stoics talked about ataraxia, tranquility, prohairesis, moral choice, or logos, universal reason, these weren't just Greek words. They were Greek concepts that didn't have exact Latin equivalents. Sure, you could translate them, but something was always lost in translation. Marcus wasn't just writing philosophy in the Meditations. He was doing philosophy. He was working through complex Stoic exercises designed to train his mind and character. These exercises had been developed in Greek, refined in Greek, and transmitted in Greek. When Marcus reminded himself to view his life from the perspective of cosmic time, or when he practiced seeing through the illusions of fame and power, He was using techniques that Epictetus and other Stoic teachers had perfected in Greek. Writing in Latin would have been like a jazz musician trying to improvise in translation. Sure, it could be done, but the authentic expression required the original language. There's also something deeply personal about Marcus's choice. The meditations weren't written for publication. They were private notes to himself. When we're talking to ourselves, we use the language that feels most natural for the thoughts we're trying to express. For Marcus, when he was thinking about the deepest questions of human existence, that language was Greek. Marcus's linguistic choice reflects a broader pattern in Roman intellectual life that persisted for centuries. Many of Rome's greatest thinkers were essentially bilingual intellectuals who moved fluidly between Latin and Greek depending on their subject matter. Cicero, Rome's greatest orator, wrote his political speeches in Latin, but his philosophical works drew heavily on Greek sources, and sometimes included extended Greek passages. The Emperor Hadrian, Marcus's predecessor, wrote poetry in both languages, but preferred Greek for his more personal compositions. Even much later, Christian theologians like St. Augustine wrote in Latin for practical theology, but engaged with Greek philosophical traditions for deeper theological questions. This wasn't about Romans feeling inferior to Greeks. By Marcus's time, Rome had been the dominant power for over 2 centuries. It was about recognizing that different languages had developed different strengths. Greek had evolved as the language of philosophical precision and intellectual exploration. Latin had evolved as the language of legal precision and administrative efficiency. Marcus's choice to write in Greek was actually a mark of Roman cultural confidence. The Romans were secure enough in their political dominance that they could acknowledge Greek intellectual superiority without feeling threatened. They could appreciate and participate in Greek culture while maintaining their own distinct Roman identity. This dynamic created one of history's great cultural syntheses. Roman political genius combined with Greek intellectual tradition produced figures like Marcus Aurelius, a man who could rule an empire with Roman efficiency while thinking about life's deepest questions with Greek philosophical sophistication. Understanding why Marcus wrote in Greek offers surprising insights into our modern globalized world. Today we have our own version of the Roman-Greek linguistic dynamic, except now English plays the role that Greek played in the ancient world. Think about it. A brilliant physicist in Japan publishes her groundbreaking research in English, not because she's not proud of Japanese culture, but because English has become the international language of scientific discourse. A philosopher in Brazil might write his most important work in English to reach a global audience, even though Portuguese is his native language. Just as Marcus used Greek because it was the established language of philosophical thought, modern intellectuals often use English because it's become the lingua franca of academic and cultural exchange. This isn't cultural colonialism. It's practical recognition that certain languages have developed particular strengths for specific types of communication. But there's a deeper parallel too. Just as Rome maintained its political and military dominance while acknowledging Greek cultural leadership, modern nations can maintain their sovereignty and cultural identity while participating in global intellectual conversations, conducted primarily in English. Marcus's example suggests that true cultural confidence comes from being able to appreciate and even adopt elements from other cultures without losing your own identity. The Romans didn't become Greeks by writing philosophy in Greek. They became better Romans. This has implications for how we think about globalization today. Cultural exchange doesn't have to mean cultural erasure. A Chinese tech entrepreneur who gives presentations in English at Silicon Valley conferences isn't abandoning Chinese culture. She's participating in a global conversation while bringing her own cultural perspective to it. But perhaps the most profound reason Marcus wrote in Greek goes beyond practical considerations about philosophical vocabulary or cultural prestige. Greek had become, in the Roman world, the language of interiority, the language for exploring inner life, personal reflection, and the deepest questions about human existence. When Marcus sat in his tent on the Germanic frontier, exhausted from the burdens of empire and facing his own mortality, he turned to Greek not just because it was the language of Stoicism, but because it had become the language of the soul. Latin was for commanding armies and governing provinces. Greek was for understanding what it meant to be human. This linguistic choice reveals something beautiful about Marcus himself. Despite being the most powerful man in the world, he recognized that the most important conversations we have are the ones we have with ourselves about how to live, how to face death, and how to find meaning in an often cruel and indifferent universe. For those conversations, Marcus needed the language that had been refined over centuries for exactly that purpose. In a way, Marcus's choice to write in Greek was the ultimate expression of Roman pragmatism. He used the best tool for the job, regardless of where it came from. For governing the empire, he used Latin and Roman administrative systems. For exploring the deepest questions of human existence, he used Greek and Greek philosophical traditions. When we ask why Marcus Aurelius wrote in Greek, we're really asking about the relationship between power and culture, between political dominance and intellectual leadership, between practical administration and personal reflection. Marcus's choice reveals that even the most powerful people often turn to traditions beyond their own when confronting life's biggest questions. The man who could have imposed Latin on the entire known world chose instead to participate in a Greek philosophical conversation that had been ongoing for centuries. This humility, the willingness to learn from other cultures and traditions, might be Marcus's greatest lesson for our modern world. In an age of cultural nationalism and intellectual isolation, Marcus shows us that true strength comes from being confident enough in your own identity to learn from others. The next time you read the Meditations, remember that you're reading the thoughts of a Roman emperor who was secure enough in his Roman identity to think his deepest thoughts in Greek. In our globalized world, where cultural exchange is both easier and more controversial than ever, Marcus Aurelius offers a model for how to maintain your own cultural identity while participating fully in the broader human conversation about what it means to live a meaningful life. His Greek Meditations remain one of the most profoundly Roman works ever written, and that paradox might be the key to understanding both Marcus Aurelius and the cosmopolitan world he helped create.